Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. Over the last 2 years, Governor Hochul has made the issue of housing one of her top priorities. Now, you'd be forgiven if you thought this was an issue just for cities like New York or Buffalo, but the issue of a lack of housing supply is a big problem in rural communities across the state as well. For more on the issue, we are joined by the executive director of the Rural Housing Coalition of New York State, Michael Borges. It's so good to see you.
Thank you for having me again.
So why don't we just start simply, what are your thoughts about this year's housing budget? I know you were at the hearing yesterday. What are some of the things you thought about?
Well, again, the governor's executive budget sort of neglected the needs of rural housing and actually cut funding for housing, which is kind of an oxymoron. You're in the middle of a housing crisis, and yet the governor's budget proposed cutting funding for Restore, which provides emergency repairs to senior citizen homes, cut funding for Access to Home, which provides accessibility modifications to the homes of disabled veterans. She cut funding for the Rural Preservation Program, which funds a network of nonprofit rural housing organizations that implements various housing programs throughout rural New York. So it was a disappointment once again, and it sort of flies in the face of logic. It's like cutting funding for the police department in the middle of a crime wave. Why would you cut funding for housing in the middle of a housing crisis?
So we have been talking about housing on this program for a while, and most of the issues revolve around things like 421A and tax abatements and building in high density areas like New York City. Rural housing communities have just as complex issues facing them. We don't hear a lot about them. What are some of them?
Well, we have an issue. There's three main issues affecting the development of housing in rural New York. One is capacity. So do we have nonprofit organizations and local governments capacity to do development? Do they have the capacity to apply for grants, to do a housing project, to build new housing, to rehab? So capacity is one thing. Infrastructure is another. Do we have water and sewer? Many communities in rural New York don't have water and sewer. How do we build housing without water and sewer or other types of infrastructure? And lastly, we don't really have a lot of targeted programs at the state level that are meant for rural communities. So we're put into a pool to compete with other larger urban areas like Rochester, Buffalo, New York City for housing dollars, and we are often at the short end of that stick.
And for a variety of reasons,
right,
including that you don't have the people to actually write the grant proposals.
Correct. Yes, exactly right. Yes. Yeah, that's the capacity part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So your organization did release a report recently, and it showed that there could be a surge in evictions in rural communities because of a Truman-era housing policy that may sunset. Tell us more.
Yes. So back in 1949, under Harry Truman, he signed a federal legislation which created a program called the USDA-515 program. It's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They funded housing, affordable housing, in rental housing in rural communities throughout the state and the country. And back in the 80s and 90s in this state, we built thousands of these units. And those 30-year mortgages are expiring. So when the mortgages expire, the affordability protections and the rental assistance that goes with them go away.
Yeah.
And so people who are living in those kinds of apartments may be kicked out because they don't get the rental assistance anymore, they can't afford to live there, or the landlord decides, I'm going to charge market rate rents, and I'm sorry, I can't afford that, I'll have to go someplace else. The problem is, there's no place for them to go. Because in rural communities, 75–78% of the housing stock is owner-occupied. Also, only a quarter is rental. So if you're looking for another rental place to go, it's scarce. So we're worried that a lot of these properties are going to be taken off the affordability list and people will become homeless.
How many properties are we talking about?
Well, there's about 400 altogether, 400 properties throughout the state. About 15,000 households are going to be affected. There's about
15,000, and these are a lot of the people who occupy these homes are older people.
Yeah, there's a lot of it is elderly. A lot of them are, again, they're all low to moderate income. There's a good chunk that are disabled. I mean, the average income is $18,000 a year, which is half the average income for the state. So it's these are the poorest of the poor, the people who need assistance the most. They're in danger of losing their homes. The state needs to step up and do something to preserve the housing that we do have. That's one of the messages I've been trying to tell the legislature. Rural communities have a lot of older housing stock. whether they're mobile homes or rental properties or whatever. We need to do more to preserve the housing that we do have as well as build new.
Okay, got it. And when is that going to expire?
Well, they all expire over the next 10 years or so.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. So the state needs to step in.
Yes.
And stop that. Now, are there legislative housing committees? They are both chaired by people from Manhattan. Okay, and I'm wondering if you feel like you're sort of left in the dust a little bit because they're sort of city-centric.
You know, I was on another radio show actually out of Syracuse or Ithaca, and the host asked me the same exact question. And I said, you know, surprisingly, no. The Senator Kavanaugh, who chairs the Housing Committee in the Senate, and Assemblywoman Rosenthal, who chairs it in the Assembly, both get rural housing needs. And last year, the legislature really stepped up and provided increases for the Rural Preservation Program, Restore, all these programs that we just talked about. They actually increased funding for rural programs. And so we're really, really grateful for their effort. And, you know, at yesterday's housing hearing, they said, you know, we still get the message. We're going to fight for you. I know we're from New York City, but we understand your needs. And it was really, really assuring to hear that. So, you know, the legislature has really stepped up, and we're really grateful for their efforts.
All right, well, that's great news. Let's go back to this Truman-era housing policy that is in jeopardy now because of the mortgages are 30-year mortgages, and they're about to expire. So where are these homes?
Homes, yeah. Well, so there's one USDA property in 85% of the counties in New York State. So they're spread out all over. There's some on Long Island. There's in Erie. There's the top 10 counties that are going to lose a lot of their properties by 2030. Like Erie is one of them. Cattaraugus, Wyoming, Oneida. You know, there's a whole.
These are very rural counties.
Yeah,
not,
they're
not
rural.
So much Erie. But
yeah. I mean, they're spread out. There's a lot of them. There's like 12,000 apartments altogether. And again, you know, they were funded by the federal government, but the federal government, especially now, has done very little to remedy the situation.
Right.
So we're asking the state to step in and preserve this housing stock. We're asking for $25 million that would allow nonprofit organizations to buy them, to rehab them, and to keep them affordable, you know, for permanently, so we don't lose the housing stock that we do have.
Got it. Talking about rural housing needs with Michael Borges. He's the executive director of the Rural Housing Coalition of New York, and it's always good to see you. Thanks,
Good to see
Michael.
You. Thank you for having me.